So it's easy to get a sense of overwhelm, isn't it? When we look at some of the things that we're talking about up here, and just how this whole system seems to be designed for this perpetual growth, that corporations really just seem, and in many ways are, way more powerful than individual countries. And so it's easy for us as individuals to say, well, look, there's nothing really we can do about it. But I actually take a different viewpoint on that. And that partly arises from this sense of the non-linearity of change. And in fact, if we look at history, there are so many examples of things that we thought could never happen that actually suddenly started happening. And then when they do happen, everyone goes, well, of course, it had to happen. It was just, it was just a matter of time, and of course. Yeah, and a recent example of that is same-sex marriage. That I have friends who said, who are married same-sex, and they thought that there was no chance that it would ever happen in their lives. Maybe at some distant future or whatever. And suddenly, within a few years, it went from this kind of pioneering idea to just becoming commonly accepted in multiple countries around the world. And there's so many examples like that. Just the abolition of slavery is a great one to look at the 19th century. And something that gives me a lot of hope is actually an idea put out by the very person that Andrew mentioned is going to be speaking here 2 weeks from now, Paul Hawken. And he wrote this book some years back called Blessed Unrest, which I loved. And he talks about, basically in his view, he spent years dialoguing with people all around the world. There's probably at least a million different organizations all around the world dedicated to fighting for humanitarian values. Some of those are the big ones we know about. Some of them are tiny little organizations, little podunk towns we don't know about, but are making a difference. And the notion is that there's a lot happening under the radar that is shifting grassroots ideas. And that's the possibility that can lead to this non-linear transformation that can move in another way. But what I feel is so important about that, and I don't know if you remember, but when I first started talking about this final chapter, I said that there's two important elements when we look at the future. One is the non-linearity of the future, which is why it's so difficult to predict. But the second one is that the future is not an objective fact. In fact, the future is something that each of us actually create through our own activities. So if enough of us start becoming aware of these issues and start becoming aware of the deeper values and changes that need to be done in order for our own children and grandchildren and their children to actually have a future that's worthwhile, there is no telling that if that can even lead to a force that can be powerful enough to even undo this, this stranglehold that the corporate system has over us right now. So I'm just curious, Paul, what you think of the possibilities.
I am impressed by the possibility. You gave one of my favorite examples on the gender issue, but there was a rumor going around that our last president was black. And if that's true, after all, in 1930s, when I was a kid, lynchings were common in the United States. You could send a picture of a burned body on a picture postcard through the U.S. mail. My first girlfriend had, it would be in the late 30s, she had her opportunities were limited if she wanted to have a career to being a secretary, a nurse, or a teacher in the lower grades. The only blacks that were in entertainment were garbage men and things like that in movies. We have changed dramatically in an area where if you had asked me when I came to Stanford, or even 10 years ago, what I thought the chances were of us having a black president, I would have said, basically maybe in 100 years, maybe. Of course, another thing that demonstrated, however, is how deep the racism is in our society. But the opportunities for change are there. We've had the changes in the past. Again, the changes that brought us into the corporate world, shall we say. happen quite rapidly. And I like to think, again, like the collapse of Russia, that we can generate a big change. I've often said in talks, when the time is right, one of the things we know from cultural evolution is when the time is right, you can get very, very rapid transitions. And I think, as I've often said, our job is to find ways to ripen the time. After all, if both of us thought it was hopeless, we would be in a bar right now. We wouldn't be haranguing you about this. But I mean, think about our kids. I'm a pervert. I am sleeping with a great-grandmother. And I, therefore, it turns out, have great-grandchildren. And I'd like to have them have a chance for a decent life. And if you have kids, you know, most of the people in this room have had a life. But what about the kids? What do you do when there's a cute little girl running around here before? What kind of a chance is she going to have if we keep on this same course? And I think we got to talk about that to people and get people out doing things.
Yeah, thank you.